So, a little bit of marketing to make the publisher happy. You can find it easiest at Kinokuniya, because we are close to KLCC. But also Gerak Budaya. Is this working? Doesn't. All right. At Gerak Budaya in PJ, Buku Fiksi in Putra Sunway, I think. Yeah, the mall. Putra Mall. I used to call it the mall because that was I remember it to be the mall. But now it's named to Putra Sunway, Putra, right? Yeah. And also several other independent bookstores like Tinta Budi, Riwayat, Arika in Georgetown and elsewhere. But easily available at Shopee. I think that's the cheapest, I suppose. And Amazon, slightly more expensive. But of course, it's also here. But it's only 10 of them. Ami has kindly given me 10 copies, just in case anybody wants to buy it. So Ami give his apologies, he couldn't be here today. Ami is the publisher of the book, which is Matahari Books, which is linked to Fiksi. Okay, enough of the book. I'm not a good salesman, so I'll just go straight to the point. Yeah, over there, sorry. I should stand over there then. So I don't want to be belabor, I don't want to go too much into all the points, but I will talk about 3 things about the book, related to the books, and also, I suppose, connected to the exhibition upstairs. The exhibition upstairs about 1990s. If you haven't been there upstairs, I recommend you go, and it's very enlightening. There's also, what I like the most upstairs is really there's a timeline of what happened in the 90s in Malaysia. I'll go a little bit of events that happened in the 90s in Malaysia. But the 3 things I want to talk about is really the interpretation of the book. There are 3 things, 3 ways to understand the book. And then after that, I'll go about why the 1990s was special in Malaysian history. There were a lot of special events that happened in Malaysian history, but the 1990s in recent years has come to the top in terms of nostalgia. Because before the 1990s, people think about 1950s, 1960s, there was nostalgia of Malaysia. But now, recently, 1990s has replaced 1950s, 1960s as a nostalgia kind of thing. And also, finally, I want to talk about the importance of moving nostalgia forward. Because, again, from 1950s and 60s, we need to move forward. History has to move forward, and the 1990s is playing into that role. So, the 3 things about the book. All right, 3 things about the books, 3 interpretations about the book. The easiest to understand the book is really to think about the title of the book, The End of the 1990s. And of course, the most obvious thing when people think about 1990s is really the 1990s, right? The reference period, the 1990s. But here, what I want to share is that when you think about 1990s, a lot of people, most people, I would too as well, think about 1990s in terms of the 10-year period, the 10 year from the January 1st, midnight, 1990, all the way to December 1st, 1 minute to midnight, 1999. That's an uncontroversial understanding of the 1990s, what most people understand as the 1990s. But the problem with thing is that a lot of events, political events, economic events, social changes, technological changes, doesn't fit quite neatly in the 1990s, right? Sometimes history begin earlier, 1990s, so to speak, as we understand it, begin actually in the 1980s, or maybe it end in the early 2000s. So history is very hard to confine within 10-year period. So if you think about the 1990s, especially within global context, if you think about the global context, the 1990s really began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1988 or 1989. So that's not 1990, that's 1989. The reason why a lot of people think the 1990s as beginning as the fall of the Berlin Wall because it's a new world order. So before there was Soviet Union and the United States with the Cold War, and suddenly was the United States as a supreme power in the global world, and that not just because of the United States. It's also because of the global economic system. Suddenly, globalization, you have free trade flourishing, and a certain way of doing things. Not just, again, not just the United States, but also places like Asia, places in Europe, places in Latin America, parts of Africa. So there were new things of doing things, new way of doing things, sorry. So that's what the first thing I want to do. But of course, here we're talking about Malaysia, right? So sometimes the way the world works, the history of the world doesn't quite translate into Malaysia. So here, again, the 1990s of Malaysia doesn't quite begin in 1990. I would argue it actually began in the mid-80s, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, the events I will talk about later, and probably end not in 2000, not in 1999, but probably 1997 and 1998 because of the Asian financial crisis and the political crisis that happened at the same time. So that's the first thing about the book. So when you think about the 1990s, don't think about the 10-year, think about the spirit of the decade and the events that allow it to happen and the event that ended it. So the second interpretation is really the purpose of the decade, right? Where, again, you have to go back to the title of the book, The End of the 1990s. But here, when people think about the end, people think about the end of the era, the end of the line. But here, the end means the purpose of the 1990s. Here, what I mean by the purpose of the 1990s, the objective in the 1990s, is really the strengthening of civic nationalism in Malaysia in contrast to the idea of ethnic nationalism that dominated Malaysian history, or Malayan history especially, for the longest time. I will talk about this further, but there were multiple iterations of civic nationalism in Malaysian history. If you think Malaysia as in Borneo, Sabah, and Singapore as well, and Malaya at that time. So there were multiple iterations of that civic nationalism, but I'll talk further. But in the 1990s was when it was probably the strongest iteration that we had. That's the second interpretation of the book. The third interpretation of the book is really the end of the 1990s, but also the end of that kind of purpose, the end of the civic nationalism in Malaysia, but also the end of the period because of the crisis that I talked about just now. Okay, that's the three interpretations of the book that would help you understand the book if you have read it or want to read about it. I think this is the slides, yeah. So, sorry, okay, sorry. No, I promise you it's just like less than 20 slides, probably just 15 slides. So reference here, okay. Okay, so the reference here, we talk about the reference here. I don't think there's anything much to talk about the reference here anymore. But what made the 1990s special? The easiest answer to that is that really because of economic growth. Economic growth was the real reason why the 1990s was special. People felt differently in a very substantial way. And it's not just some people, it's also about a lot of people, right? There's a lot of talk about inequality, but in the 80s and the 90s, there were really a kind of change in the economy that a lot of people start to feel it across society, across geography, although that's a controversial statement. But in some ways, yes. But the real reason, if you look at it, this is GDP numbers, real GDP numbers accounted for inflation from 1960, which is accounting for Sabah and Sarawak as well, before the formation of Malaysia. And also, I suppose, they ignore Singapore over there. And all the way to 1923, which was 2 years ago. This is source from the World Bank. So real economic numbers. So if you see before the 1980s, the growth, the slope, I suppose, the slope of growth was quite flat. It was rising, but it's quite flat. But things started to change in the 1980s, 1990s, right? If you see, it's like very flat, and suddenly the slope changed quite drastically. And that slope is pretty much constant after a while. Those what made 1990s special, because it changed the outlook. It's not the outlook, it's just the nature of Malaysian economy from just extraction to, in this case, manufacturing, right? I'll go into that later. But this is sometimes if you do a little bit of mathematics or economics, sometimes if you do chart like this, it's very hard to make comparison because it's numbers, it's linear, and a 10% growth over year wouldn't show, but a 10% growth over year, you will see it. So it's an artifact of the mathematics. This is something wrong with it. It's something that you can't do. But a lot of economists, what they do is that they put this number into a natural log so that the small numbers would be able to compare the small numbers with the big numbers. So a 10% over here would appear in that thing, unlike here. You wouldn't be able to see it. So here, if you did a little bit of economics, especially macroeconomics, in some ways, this is a cheating way of doing it. There's a more complicated way, but I'm just too lazy to do a lot of modeling for this presentation. I'm sorry about that. Busy life, busy. but a cheating way of doing it is that whatever you do, if you do a natural log of GDP line, you will get, and then you do a straight line, essentially. There's a coefficient to it, I promise you, but this is essentially a straight line. You draw a straight line. So you can see a potential growth for Malaysia in the long run, right? So in theory, this is what Malaysian growth should have grown if you take into account all the variation in Malaysian economy. So the blue line is a real number, the real GDP number. The red line is a theoretical number. So every time the blue line falls, I don't know whether you can see it properly. I hope you can see the gap between the red line and the blue line. So the red line, what most economists would call potential economic output. So theoretically, you will be able to grow at that point, whatever point in time. And the blue line is real. So every time the blue line goes below the red line, that means there's a gap in output, meaning that you are growing less than potential. So if you, again, to understand 1990s, really the special of the 90s is about economic growth. So if you see starting from 1980s and 1990s, the blue line is actually above the red line. So that means Malaysia was growing above potential. In fact, you could see this. Growth was growing about 9%, 7, 8, 9, 11, 11% at one time. So this happened in the 1990s. And of course, after the Asian financial crisis, it goes down a little bit. And then you can see the damage of the COVID recession over there. We certainly hasn't recovered from COVID, despite the fact that growth has been strong for the past year or 2 years, right? So this is what made 1990 special. We were growing above potential growth. I'll go into details. This is very theoretical, but I think that's a good way to understand why 1990s were special in Malaysian history. But, so why did 1990s happen? I think when we think about Malaysia, Malaysian history especially, we tend to think about Malaysia in a very insular way. We think that, things that happen in Malaysia only happen in Malaysia, but we forget a lot of time Malaysia is we call medium-sized economy, which is very open, and events in the world does affect Malaysia in very way. And the 1990s happened because of events at the global stage, right? So I'll go this slowly, but not all of it. Hopefully I can get to the important one. So of course, Malaysia was founded in 1963, sorry. Too much 1990s. I wrote the book for 8 years, so sometimes it's very hard to get the number out. So 1960s, Malaysia was formed. And then, of course, the Merdeka and there's the colonial period over here. And then the Singapore were expelled or exited Malaysia, depending on interpretation or the document that you see. And of course, the NEP. NEP is it's very hard not to talk about NEP, the new economic policy, if you talk about Malaysian history. So, but when you talk about NEP, people talk about affirmative action. But I think the more important thing is really what happened in the NEP is that it encouraged two things that I thought was important to Malaysian industrialization. One was NEP encouraged migration from the countryside to the urban side, right? Because the nature of the modern economy, the movement towards colonial economy to modern economy, all the modern jobs at that time were in the cities. So migration really helped increase labor supply in the Malaysian economy, in the modern economy. That's really helped in pushing for Malaysian industrialization and manufacturing. And of course, when you have migration to the cities, and then you have urbanization. So these two things are very important. And when people think about NEP, talk about affirmative action, people tend to forget that the bigger factor behind it, migration and urbanization, that powered I suppose I would call in the book Malaysian industrialization, Malaysia industrial revolution, right? So that happened, that created that little boost in labor supply in the Malaysian economy. And then because NEP is a very expensive policy. It's affirmative action, it is expensive. So, and then also, again, a lot of corruption as well happened. But it's expensive, so the government had to spend money. But the reason why government had surplus money was because of the war in Israel, the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria, I think, invaded. I don't know, I don't remember. There's multiple Israel war, but there's a Yom Kippur War when Egypt and Israel and was it Jordan or Syria? I can't remember. Jordan, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm more than happy to be corrected. So that war in the Middle East, and that created a little bit of a backlash in the form of oil supply. So oil supply, the crisis, there were embargo as well by the Arab economies against America. So that pushed oil prices up. At that time, Malaysia also had a lot of oil at that time. They were discovering oil and stuff. So the boost in oil prices naturally boosted the coffer, the public coffer, the government revenue, right? So that helps sustain NEP, but also industrialization effort as well, right? So that's a lucky break for Malaysia. There's a Yom Kippur War. Israel in some ways helped us. And of course, they had Petronas, and then that's really boosted the way Malaysia managed our natural resources, so become more efficient. Because before Petronas, a lot of this money went to the concessionaire, were Shell, or Exxon maybe, I don't know, Total, I don't know, can't remember all the names. But those money were directed toward Malaysia because of Petronas. And of course, the other thing was the Iranian Revolution. A lot of people forget the impact of the Iranian Revolution on Malaysia. But the impact of the Iranian Revolution is also boosted oil prices because the 1970s was a crazy year, was a crazy decade in terms of war. So Iranian Revolution boosted oil prices, or another boost to Malaysian revenue. Should be a government revenue, shouldn't say Malaysian revenue. But more importantly, also it created a modern Islamic state. So this is important in Malaysian politics because before the Iranian Revolution, there were a lot of people were criticizing that the idea of Islamic State were medieval ideas. The Iranian suddenly, because of their success, gave modern Islamists, used to speak, an idea that actually it could work. So this, when the Iranian Revolution happened, and then you have ABIM, you have all this also Islamist group, student Islamic group, that in the end came to power in Malaysia later. In fact, Anwar Ibrahim was a member of ABIM, and now he's Prime Minister. So Iranian Revolution is important in Malaysian history. A lot of people forget about that. And then I think importantly, at that time, Malaysia was also industrializing. Like I said just now, there were labor movement, labor improvement, technological improvement, manufacturing were becoming more important. Because in 1960s, urbanization was about 25%, if I'm not mistaken. Was it 60s or 70s? Was 25%. By the 1990s, it reached 50%. And by the 2000, it was already 70, 80%. Right now, it's about probably close to 90% already. So that shows that Malaysia is actually an urbanized country, despite the fact that we tend to look at the countryside with kind of nostalgia, when in fact, most Malaysians actually live in the cities and the suburb. Yeah. So the more you have all this background event that happened before the 1980s. In the 1980s, one important thing that happened was the Plaza Accord. Plaza Accord is a arrangement between the US, Japan, and Germany, and several other G6 countries at the time. Right now it's G10, I don't know. To let the Japanese yen appreciate. Because during this time, in the background, because of the New World Order, because of the Second World War, Japan was in ashes, and they re-industrialized quite quickly. So Japan was really the first Asian miracle before what we had, the Asian tigers, the Singapore, the Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea. Japan was the first one to do that. In fact, the history of Japan probably go back to, sorry, there's no line over there. Goes back to the 1880s during the Meiji Restoration. Was it 1980s or 1960s? Can't remember. So that's the Japanese history. And then the Second World War happened, and then there's an atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The thing with Japan is that they re-industrialized quite fast, and then they become dominant in manufacturing across the world, and in the cars, in electronics, in their Walkmans and stuff. And America at that time were concerned that the Japanese product was becoming too competitive. And Ford and GM were concerned that Toyota and Hondas and Mazdas were selling better cars in the US instead of them. And then they blamed the Japanese for playing with their currencies. They're undervaluing their currencies, the yen. So in 1985, if I'm not mistaken, they came together after a lot of pressure by the US to allow the yen to appreciate. So this is an important thing to Malaysia. Despite the fact it happened in a global stage, the yen appreciated quite drastically. I don't have the chart with me, but it appreciated quite strongly. And that caused problem with Japanese economy, Japanese manufacturers, especially Hitachi, Mitsubishi, all those trading houses. I cannot name all of them, but probably Wikipedia would help. So the important thing is that once your currency become too expensive, your export become too expensive, right? So these Japanese companies had to go out of Japan to lower their costs. So one of the places they came was Malaysia, right? And then that helped Malaysian industrialization quite significantly. Because before, Malaysia was industrializing in the 1970s. And then you have Intel in Penang, you have all this chip manufacturer in the early days. And then suddenly you have a Japanese investment in terms of automotive, in terms of chip, in terms of aircon. At one time, Malaysia was the largest aircon producer in the world. It's crazy. Now, of course, it's China. But back then, it was Malaysia. It was crazy, really crazy. So you have all these crazy numbers happening in the 1980s and 1990s because of the industrialization that happened. They started in the 1970s and get on in the 1980s, and then really boosted because of the Plaza Accord. And of course, it was the 1980s recession. That also changed the nature of the Malaysian economy, because the 1998 recession was driven by collapse in commodity prices. Right now, we think about commodity, we think about crude oil, natural gas, palm oil. But back then, there was tin, there was rubber, there were a couple other things that we don't do it anymore. But the collapse of commodity prices in the 1980s caused some of these commodities become less important to Malaysia. And it really hurt Malaysian economy. But here, Mahathir is already in power for the first time, I should say. So here, when you start to remember about privatization, the privatization of TNB, the corporatization of Shabas, whatever, Plus Highway, or whatever privatization that happened, because government needed money fast. So the only way you can get money fast is to sell off your stake in these companies. So that's when privatization happened. And of course, the irony is that all the privatization was overturned during the Asian financial crisis because government bailed them out. But here, something interesting happened, right? Because from here, you have ethnic nationalism happening. You have like race riots over here, a lot of race riots over here, and then you have NEP. And then there's a feeling that this is a Malay country. There's a Malaysian Malay. In fact, Singapore was kicked out because of the difference between Malaysian Malaysia and the Malay Malaysia, right? So that was the first iteration of the civic nationalism, or second iteration of civic nationalism in Malaysia. So that failed, and then there was a little bit of pessimism about what civic nationalism in Malaysia mean. It seems that the Malay was on the forefront of the primary identity of Malaysia. But something happened here. The 1988 constitutional crisis. This is when Mahathir almost lost power. Mahathir, actually UMNO, if you remember, Tengku Razali and Mahathir Mohamad had a little bit of fight. And Tengku Razali very cleverly somehow almost won, and they were unhappy with the result because Mahathir won in some ways, and they went to the courts, and the court says, okay, UMNO is an illegal party, right? So something happened. So Mahathir so they went to the courts. Some of you might be lawyers. They'll probably remember this if you're old enough. I'm not that old, by the way. I just read them. So Tengku Razali and the, I don't know, 12, 11, I can't remember the number anymore. I'm really bad with numbers, despite the fact that I'm an economist. So they went to the courts. They won, except that they won by too much. The court banned UMNO. So what Mahathir did is that Mahathir, okay, I don't want to fight in the courts. So I created UMNO Baru, which is UMNO of today. So Mahathir had UMNO Baru, and the rest of the group that won the court case but lost in the political battle formed Semangat 46 with Tengku Razali, right? So this where things really interesting happened, because suddenly Mahathir lost the Malay support, because the Malay support is actually with Tengku Razali, right? And Mahathir decided, okay, I lost the Malay support. How can I win the votes? So he actually, there's an election in 1982. The Barisan Nasional did quite badly. They won, but did quite badly. So it's quite clear Mahathir thought that we have to look out for the Malay community for support in the ballot box. So this is when suddenly you hear Wang Kawasan 2020, the idea about creating a more inclusive Malaysia, a more equal Malaysia, and also you start to hear about Bangsa Malaysia for the first time, I think. So this is where it happened. But when I talk about this, of course you have to talk about the Berlin Wall, but I wouldn't digress over that. It's another hole to go through. But here is something happened, right? Because the reason Bangsa Malaysia suddenly came to prominence was because of political necessity by Mahathir. The political necessity. Mahathir had to survive somehow. And if you don't do this, then Tengku Razali will be the next Prime Minister of Malaysia. And Tengku Razali didn't become the next Prime Minister of Malaysia. Mahathir became the next Prime Minister for the next, quite a long time. And by 1986, another election, I think, or whatever. So basically, they did Barisan Nasional quite well, in fact. And of course, there's the Asian financial crisis, which we'll go later, that undo a lot of things. So when I talk about the reason why Bangsa Malaysia became to prominence because of political necessity, but at the base of it was really the industrialization that happened for the longest time. The migration, the urbanization, and I think also integration of communities in the cities. Because in the cities, for the longest time, it's multicultural. Well, multicultural because there were a lot of formerly economic migrant, were the Chinese, the Indian, the not Anglo-Saxon, the white guys, yeah. They were multicultural in that way. And they were, of course, Malays and Arabs as well, but they were very, very minority. But because of the NEP, or the migration that happened, and the urbanization process, which is a subsequent process, a consequential process, these people were forced to live together in the cities. And because it's a new society as well, technology was changing, the way of life changing, so there's a little bit of your life become unanchored from the old days. Your cultural norms suddenly become less relevant, because in the city, it's very different from in the kampong. So you have to relearn how to be nice to people. You have to relearn how to cooperate, collaborate, and not bergaduh all the time. So and you have this process. And then, of course, there's industrialization. What industrialization means that there were new jobs happening, and there were a lot of jobs for everybody. So people become less inclined to bergaduh in some ways, right? Because you remember, one thing I remember, during the Second World War and up to 1960s, 1969, there's a lot of riots happening. People only remember 1969, but there were a lot of riots happening at that time in KL, in JB, in Georgetown. And this was partly because of the Second World War, because of the Japanese occupation. Japanese occupation happened at the time Japan was occupying China, and the Japanese hated the Chinese because of the resistance that happened in northern China. And they came to Malaya and Southeast Asia. They had this enmity for Chinese people, and the Chinese had to run into the countryside. And this during the Second World War. And when the Malays were in the countryside, the Chinese in the countryside, and they were really tough time. They were time of shortages, famine, not enough food, and suddenly you have this competition between communities, right? So that's a lot. There's an author, can't remember the name of the author. I'm really bad with naming, but there's a book, Red Star over Malaya. Yeah, Red Star over Malaya. Anybody remember the name of the author? Yeah, Chobon. Yeah, thank you. Again, I'm really bad. If I sit on for exam for history, I will fail, definitely, despite the fact I know all these things. So he proposed, or I think he explained quite convincingly, that the ethnic relation between Malays and Chinese become what it is today because of what happened during the Second World War, because of the competition for resources under a very stressful time. And that lasted for so long. And there's also partly because of the racial riot that happened up to 1969. And somehow it ended because the government was become a little bit more authoritarian. But if you notice, suddenly the racial trouble become less and less reported from the 1970s, 1980s, all the way to 1990s. This is really because of economic growth. If you contrast the economic growth of the 1980s, 1990s, and the troubles of during the Second World War and post-World War, it's quite clear that there's a correlation between strong economic growth, strong, robust, widely shared economic growth, effect on racial harmony in some ways, communal harmony. So because there's less competition, less harmful competition, people are able to collaborate. So that happened in the 90s. So that again, to summarize, economic growth, industrialization, migration, urbanization, and the force. I suppose another thing I'd say is alienation, but whatever. So people were forced to collaborate at a time when economic growth was strong. So this allowed what Mahathir wanted to do. They allowed him to do Wawasan 2020 and Bangsa Malaysia, and people like laughed at it. People like, whoa, we believe in this. We believe in this. So Bangsa Malaysia. And so in the 1990s, you have a lot of slogans, a lot of songs that a lot of people still remember today, surprisingly. The songs are really bad, really. But people remember it, right? People really remember it. If you do it right now, a song about one Malaysia, and then the current song they sing in school, nobody really remembered it because it seems to be unimportant. But in the 1990s, people remember this because it feels like there's a new era for Malaysia. Suddenly, okay, we are all Malaysian, we all are equal, we all could be, if we work hard, we can be somebody, and we can be there together. That's the idea, what happened in the 80s, Bangsa Malaysia now. So it's really important. The underlying economic growth was really important in allowing that inclusive identity to happen. But of course, good thing wouldn't last forever, unfortunately. In 1987, 1988, there's something called the Asian financial crisis, and that really brought multiple economies in Asia to its knee. Started in Thailand because of the Thai borrowed too much forex borrowing, denominated in USDs, and then suddenly the problem with the Thais as well, they used a lot of this borrowing into real estate, right? And real estate, you buy too much real estate, after a while there's a bubble, and people start to realize, oh, this is too expensive, I'm not going to buy it, and then suddenly everybody panics, and the economy goes to hell. So that happened in Thailand. But the problem with Thailand is that, the problem with this part of the world at that time, a lot of people, especially in the US, in Europe, think that, oh, this Thai, who are these Thais? We cannot find it on the map. It's Asia. And then the whole region started in crisis. It came to Malaysia, it came to Indonesia, it came to Philippines. South Korea had trouble. China had a little bit of trouble, but China is too big and not too open yet at the time, but they're doing okay. Hong Kong was in trouble. Did I say Taiwan? There's too many countries in this part of the world. So they got in trouble. Malaysia and the Asian financial crisis before COVID was the worst recession that Malaysia ever had. And it's true not just for Malaysia, it's true for a majority of Southeast Asian economy till these days. COVID was really bad, but that's a different story. So when you had a crisis, and then you had people believing into, this good time could last forever, and it didn't last forever, people started to not believe you anymore. It's feel a little bit of a broken promise, right? If somebody promised you could be equal, everybody could be Malaysian, everybody could be, work hard and work well, and you have a place under the sun like everybody else. But once you suddenly lost your jobs, once your car got repossessed, you cannot finance your housing loan anymore, your mortgage, and then a lot of people have to leave the city and go back to live with their parents. At that time, that is an extremely embarrassing experience to do that. So the shame, the embarrassment, and the economic crisis caused by the economic crisis really killed the idea of Bangsa Malaysia, because Bangsa Malaysia had to survive on economic growth. If there's no economic growth, you cannot make the promise of Bangsa Malaysia. And of course, Malaysia got richer after a while, right? I mean, they were trouble here, was big trouble over there. People lost their job, but they found a job later. But you have to remember, this is like 4 years later. So one of the things that economists do is that when they have a crisis, they try to measure how quickly you can get back to pre-crisis level of economic growth. So if you have a crisis over here, they would try to say, okay, but recovery would happen by 2000. They will some kind of recovery, right? So you could see here a big hole over there. So that's about 3 or 4 years of really real difficulties, despite the fact that the recession only in 1988 or 1997. But it took a lot of time to recover. So because people were on full speed ahead over here, again, remember, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. The growth that you experienced that was really a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Europe had this kind of thing for 100 years, industrial revolution for 100 years. Malaysia did this in probably 20 years. So imagine the change of lifestyle, the change in outlook, the change in beliefs, the change in relationship between people. It's crazy, right? Industrial revolution is crazy. So that the crisis happened, and people stopped believing in that. And this really a big damage to the idea of Bangsa Malaysia. And of course, I said just now, you had growth afterwards, right? You look at this, growth afterwards seems to be not too bad, right? It seems to be strong growth. But the thing is, growth over here is quite slow. If I just have another slide, if I can show you. I'm probably not going to use all the slide. I've overzealously drew the slide, but okay, all right, shit. Sorry, sometimes I swear. So yeah, you can see these are 10-year growth on average. It's like, compound annual growth rate. If you know that, if you don't know that, just say it's growth. So in 1990s was quite strong, right? 1970s was strong, but again, the thing that I said about now, 10% growth when the level is very low, looks very small, but 10% growth when the number is big, looks very, very big. So this is what in 1990s looked like. It's like almost 10% in average. This is median, I think, or median, yeah, 7%. That means some growths are like here in some years. Some growths are down here, obviously, but quite impressive, given now we have a really hard time to break 5% these days. So if you notice in the 2000s, there's a big difference, right? The median growth for the 1990s was about 9%. Now it's like about probably 5.5%. And then later into 2010, it's even slower. So if you look at this, okay, so it looks like it's growing, but it's growing at a slower rate. So when people are used to this kind of growth, they create some kind of expectation, and the growth afterward really about unmet expectation. People start to compare the Badawi years, the Allah Badawi years with Mahathir years. This is part of the reason why Allah Badawi, despite being a decent prime minister, had a lot of trouble in the 2000s. Because of this, people were so used to high growth, they were dissatisfied with slower growth, which is not so bad actually, but the slower growth really killed it. And then there's a lot of argument about, a lot of racism started to happen at that time as well. That started to return. That's something that you heard less rarely. You heard fewer in the headlines, I guess. In the 1990s, you start to hear more in the 2000s. There were people like church bombing, pighead in Surau. There were Bible, there's holy water kind of conspiracy started to go around, conversion issues. So that happened in the 2000s. Again, there's the common theme here. The common theme is the economic growth is quite slow over there. And part of the reason why economic growth was slow was not just because of the damage brought by the Asian financial crisis, but also because China joined the WTO. This is a big, big thing in recent history. In fact, China in WTO is probably the single most biggest event in the past 20 years in the whole global history, because it changed the balance of power at the global stage, and it also affected Malaysia. So here, how Malaysia was affected. If you remember the Plaza Accord, the agreement between Japan, Germany, and the US, that was very positive for Malaysia. For here, it's a little bit negative. Here, what happened is that China suddenly joined the WTO, because before the WTO, China product had to face some kind of tariff across the world, right? Because they're not member of the WTO. Member of the WTO tend to, you sell me stuff, I charge you slow, you charge me less, that kind of thing. There's a like buddy-buddy kind of association. So China joined WTO. So suddenly China is a buddy. So tariff had to go down for China. And China, because it's a 1.1 billion people at the time, or 1 billion people at the time, as a manufacturing powerhouse, and China itself had been reforming for the past 30 years, right? There's a story that, what's his name? I can't remember, one of the Chinese premier made a visit to Southeast Asia. In the 1990s. He went to Singapore, Bangkok, KL, I think, and then Manila. And he was surprised that Southeast Asia was so modern. And then he realized that China was behind. That's when the reform happened. Zhurongji, I think. Can't remember the name. There's the reform happening in China at that time. So that reform happened also in parallel. And by the time China joined WTO, China was quite competitive in terms of manufacturing. And China was so competitive that places like Penang started to hollow out factory was moving to China, to Shenzhen. So if you remember again, if you read the news in 2000, there were panic in Penang about the fall of manufacturing in Penang, also the wider Malaysian economy. So the competition between Malaysia and China, and this is the reason why growth was quite slow from here all the way up there in comparison to the 1990s. And of course, it's a global financial crisis, but I don't think you'll be interested in that. I don't want it to turn into an economic history class, okay? So this I want to talk about next. Why, despite the fact that Malaysia continued to grow richer, despite the crisis of the 1990s, despite the fact that we are growing slower, but Malaysia is definitely much richer now compared to the 1990s. In fact, again, I have to use this chart. It's a really good chart. These are, in the 1990s, if you think about it, this is about 100%, 200%, almost 300% increase in GDP since the 90s. So we are becoming richer. In fact, we are, in many ways, on the verge of becoming a high-income economy. Shocking, but that's what it is, right? In fact, just if Malaysia had a more stable forex, I'm not saying it's a good idea to peg the ringgit, but if Malaysia had a more stable forex, this is in terms of ringgit, but in terms of dollars, which how you measure whether the country income high level or not, Malaysia is probably should be a member of OECD right now, right? But of course, there are other charts as well. You're not seeing chart for Taiwan or South Korea, which probably more impressive. In fact, again, I think one last point before I leave the economic history apart, the recession of the 1980s is also important in the way that was when Korea and Taiwan started to outrace Malaysia. Because before this, South Korea and Taiwan and Malaysia is about the same level in terms of development. But the crisis of the 1980s, the way the government handled it was less than ideal. So, but I mean, it's probably unfair to say less than ideal because it's quite a tough thing to handle if your economy is based on natural resources in terms of tin, rubber, and all these commodity prices collapsed at the same time. And people thought, okay, if you diversify in your natural resources, you might be able to handle it. But in the 1980s, all natural resources prices came down. So it was a difficult years. So Malaysia had trouble in the 1980s. But in the meantime, Taiwan and South Korea was really booming and just leaving everyone behind. That's the importance of the 1980s recession. And, sorry, yeah, okay. So, all right, thanks. So again, coming back to this. So why? Why after the 1990s, in the 2000s, despite the fact that we are growing richer, why Bangsa Malaysia cannot come back to the top as a primary identity of Malaysian? Again, I mentioned just now, economic growth is actually about unmet expectation. People stop believing in that because sometimes there's correlation, but sometimes the structural break and the correlation runs a little bit. So one factor is just unmet expectation in terms of growth. I mean, secondly, again, I like to stress about the importance of economic growth to the formation of a more inclusive identity. But there's always social limits to growth. You cannot grow forever, however fast, because we are human, we adapt. We're not robots, we adapt. So some factors become less important across the years. And the social limits here is because back during the intense migration to the cities and the urbanization that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, back then there was something that I call alienation that I mentioned just now, right? Alienation in the sense that when you, from the cities, from the kampongs, from the rural areas, whether you're Malay or Chinese or anybody else, you go to cities, you don't know anybody. You are forced to mingle. So when you go to the city, you feel a bit of alienation in order to address the alienation, you have to make friends. And I think if any of you studied abroad for the first time, you probably feel a little bit of alienation as well, because you feel alone, you feel lonely, so you need to make friends. So that what happened in Malaysia because people had to make friends in the multicultural city. They were, of course, bubble in the cities, but a lot of time when you go to work, you have to meet people of various backgrounds. So you have to integrate, you have to make friends, you have to collaborate. But these days, that's not really easy to do, because the cities, back then, the cities were developing, were evolving, but now the cities are a little bit more, it's not concrete, what's the word? It's more solidified, more fossilized, yeah. Thank you. So the cities have become more fossilized, right? So if you go, for instance, in PJ, you see the demographic is very different from the one in, Keramat or Kampung Baru or Wangsa Maju. So because people are so comfortable anymore, they don't need to, make the effort to make the extra step to be nice to people across various background, talk to them, be friends with them. They don't need to do that anymore because it's so comfortable. In fact, now, before in the 80s and the 90s, there was really no highways. The Plus Highway was really a very small highway. So it takes time to travel from KL to Alor or Kota Baru or JB. So the distance between your kampong or your places make your identity become separate from your parents. So your identity becomes less dependent on your parents, but more dependent on your neighbors, on your friends, on your colleagues. So that what happened in the 1980s and the 90s. So people were forced to collaborate. That's no longer the case these days. Now, of course, there's a smaller shared space. These are issues that we have to address. But I think one problem is that that exacerbated the idea of less shared space is really the liberalization of international school in the early 2000s. So that really killed shared space for young Malaysians, because suddenly the rich can go to international school, and then the people that were not well-to-do were left in the public school, and then public school also is divided across lines, which might create issues in terms of shared space. So this doesn't happen, that we have this challenge now. Of course, finally, new technology. Back then, you were forced to be friends with people across the table. Now you don't need to, you play with your phone. I do it as well. But, again, social limit of growth. Those are, the economic growth are important, but there are social limits to it. So that's part of the reason why we had trouble with Bangsa Malaysia now. So finally, the final section of the presentation, thank you. So apart from that, a lot of people say to me that the book is very depressing. I don't mean to make people depressed. But I think one important thing, one other criticism that I face is really that the book is about the nostalgia by millennials, right? So but my answer to that criticism is that somehow in Malaysia we think of history as Sriwijaya, or maybe Tang Dynasty in China, or Malacca, definitely the Sultanate of Malacca, maybe the colonial period, British Malaya, North Borneo, Sarawak, the Brooks. So that's history, right? Maybe the farthest way we will go down the history is that there was Merdeka in 57, woo! There were Malaysia, was Singapore, and then maybe a little bit of NEP and a little bit of history that we seem to tiptoe a little bit in the 1980s. We don't really take history in the 1990s very seriously, apart from the, sometimes the professors of history or political science write in the papers that nobody reads. Sorry. I hope there's nobody in university here. Yeah, sorry about that. No, but the main point is that we don't take 1990s as a serious history. We think about it as nostalgia, as you know, as about as a remembering, as an unofficial remembering. People remember this. Yeah, we remember this. Yeah, when you were young, didn't you do this? We watch the TV. You know? So it's not serious history. It's something that you talk on the table or at a dinner, during lunch or whoever. Right? We don't take 1990s as serious history. One of the reasons why is that a lot of people in the 90s are still alive, right? There's a joke in economics that says, economics progresses one funeral at a time. It's true. Economics is very, you know, when you have different idea in economics, people tend to hit you hard in the head. That's really competitive. But again, because some of the big figures in economics die, so they allow for room for new ideas to come in. The same with any other field. Same with Malaysia as well. In Malaysia, people that were very crucial in the creation of Malaysian history in the 1990s are still alive. Mahathir is still alive. Anwar Ibrahim is Prime Minister. I mean, I could name a lot of names. They're still there. So it becomes taboo, right? You don't want to get in trouble. When talk about a lot of things with Malaysian is that Malaysians are very, very nice, at least in public. As long as you're not anonymous, right? If you're not anonymous, you're something to somebody can recognize you. People are generally nice. So if one way to describe it is that when somebody died in the press, there will be obituary, right? If you read the writings, they talk about all the nice things. It's never critical, even if the person might be, you know, very controversial. They never say anything bad about him, because it's just the nature of society in Malaysia. So in that way, it is a taboo. A lot of 1990s is still taboo. And again, I already mentioned history is stuck in 1950s and 70s, because before the because I mentioned it way earlier just now, the previous nostalgia about Malaysia was in the 1950s and 1970s. People seem to think, the older generation definitely, think that the golden age of Malaysia was 1950s, 1970s, or 1960s. Despite the fact that 1960s we were fighting a war, and 1950s was, again, 1960s is understandable because it was Merdeka, it was a new era, and Tunku Abdul Rahman was calling himself the happiest prime minister in the world. So that's understandable. But the problem is we need to move forward with our life. And if we're stuck with that kind of nostalgia, we will never move it. And then everything will still be taboo. In fact, today we are able to talk about the riots of 1969 quite openly. Before, never. Before, it was like, don't talk about it or you're going to cause trouble. So that's the sign of maturity, of moving history. But that's still, 1969 is like, what, 50 years ago, 40 years ago? 50, 40 years? Yeah. 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. Yeah. So we need to move forward. And one way is actually to move nostalgia forward, rather than talking about 1950s and 60s. Of course, it's important to understand 1950s and 60s. We also have to start to take the 1990s more seriously as history. And as a nostalgia, as remembering, we have to take it more seriously. That's partly the reason why I wrote the book, although the reason why I wrote the book was because I was very angry at the time. So yeah. So the problem with the book is that, are we stuck here? Are we stuck with our, you know, we are stuck to be quarreling with each other? What are the ingredients that would enable Bangsa Malaysia or any kind of iteration of civic nationalism to happen in Malaysia? Could we grow away from ethnic nationalism that dominate our politics and society? I think the lesson of the 1990s is that it's possible. We did it. We did it for a while, right? In fact, we did it 3 times. We did it during Malayan Union, but Malayan Union wasn't popular, so it failed. And then we were doing it. Lee Kuan Yew was doing it, I should say, in Malaysia. It failed because Again, the politics didn't align with the demographic reality of Malaya at that time, or Malaysia at that time, sorry. Sorry, I hope there's no Sabah Sarawak. I mean, you should be here, but sometimes it's very hard. Because history, again, Malaysian history is very centered in Peninsula Malaysia. That's very bad. But I think that's something to explore elsewhere. But again, what NTNT tells us is that a different Malaysia is possible. And the ingredients, we know what ingredients are, although things are changing. And, sorry, could you move? Yeah, next. Next, yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is fine, this is fine. So, funny thing is that sometimes history moves in cycle, which is like repeating itself. Because in the 1980s, what happened in the 1990s is that there was some kind of shifting supply chain because of Plaza Accord, right? Because the Japanese company had to move elsewhere, and Intel had to move as well from California to Malaysia. Malaysia was integrated into the supply chain. Funnily enough, 40 years later, Trump is in power, and Trump is forcing supply chain to change again, right? So these are what happened in the 1980s, 1970s. Things were changing, and things are changing now. So if we take the idea that economic growth is fundamental to the creation of an inclusive society, inclusive identity, then this is our chance. This is our chance to make sure that foundation is strong enough so that we can explore creating civic nationalism all over again for the fourth time, I guess, in Malaysian history. But this is a very tough time to do, right? Because you never know what's going to happen. You could easily go the other way and make things worse. A trade war with Trump and China and everybody else would easily make the growth go much, much slower and make people less happy with their lives and start to quarrel louder. So that's a risk. But if we are successful, we could have a chance of creating Bangsa Malaysia again. And for that, I think I'll take question if you have question. I don't think that's it. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz. We have time now for Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, please raise their hands and a mic will be handed to you.
Okay, hello. Sorry, it's on, yeah? Okay, thanks so much for the talk today. I have a, slightly theoretical question to ask, if you don't mind. So from the presentation that you've given so far, would you say that a sense of growth rather than absolute wealth or absolute GDP is central to the possible creation of civic nationalism? Thank you.
If I could repeat that question, if I make sure that I understand it, you're asking whether the sense of growth instead of
let's say like the actual absolute GDP.
Okay.
Because from the chart that you presented just now, again, you pointed out how, like after the 90s, then actual GDP did grow, but it's simply that the sense of growth wasn't quite as sharp as the 90s. So I'm wondering whether you feel that that very sharp sense of economic growth is the central driving point behind the possibility of a different form of nationalism. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I would think so. Sense of growth, yeah. Yeah, that's probably more direct way of saying it rather than just showing the chart just now. So yeah, I think the sense of growth is important, but it's only important because the sense of growth means that people feel that they are not threatened, their livelihood is not threatened. When you feel your livelihood is not threatened, then you can be nice to other people. But if you feel you are threatened, then you start to be nasty to other people because you know he's gonna eat my cake if I don't eat my cake right now. But if there's a sense of growth, then you can say theoretically that, okay, he can eat my cake, there will be a cake tomorrow for me, or there will be a cake in the next 5 minutes. So I don't have to kick him in the nuts for taking my cakes away. But of course, this is a simplifying, right? So the idea is that there are growth, then people don't have to fight. So that idea means that you can have a different kind of competition rather than the very toxic competition. You can have a different kind of competition in a situation where there is growth. Yeah, so I agree with you. Sense of growth is important.
My question is regarding the shared space argument. Right now, shared space is mostly moved online already.
Yep.
Yeah. But at the same time, with the move into the internet, algorithms tend to concentrate communities
Yep.
together,
Yep.
which creates a pressure of self-segregation,
Yep.
whether or not they want to or not. It's just kind of an alignment that just naturally happens as people try to gather with their own community. Now, this is a new technology that didn't exist during, not to say, it was still in the heyday in the 1990s. So we couldn't really judge how it was back then and how it would interact with the rise of civic nationalism. So my question is how do you think about the internet and this tendency to self-segregate and how we interact with a potential rise in civic nationalism in a time of rising opportunity for Malaysia as the bifurcating of supply chain happens?
Yep. I think definitely a tough question because I don't know the answer. But I think a lot of time, yes, it's true that a lot of interaction are moving online, and all this algorithm does make us self-segregate online by the fact that we don't have to. But I think at the same time, we have to remember we're also a social being in the physical way as well. And this is where schools are important. It's not just schools, it's also about workplace, it's also about where you go to the playground, your neighborhood, right? The neighborhood. So I don't know how to handle the segregation online that happens, but it's easier to address segregation in the real world. For instance, in Singapore, I don't like Singapore policy, a lot of them, but there are some good policy from Singapore in terms of housing, right? The policy in Singapore, if I remember correctly, in terms of housing, they force people to mingle in the place. So that's one way to do it. You have quotas of certain place, you force it to mix. But of course in Malaysia it's a bit hard because, and then you talk about your masjid, and then you talk about your temples, there's other issues happening that also might cause friction. So it's a difficult subject. So the next thing you think about, for me, one policy that I would like to introduce is really to deliberalize international school. So you disallow Malaysian to enroll in international school and force them to go to national school. Because the liberalization of the education system for the international school done in 2000 under Hishamuddin, I'm not mistaken, really damaged the role of national schools. Not just national school like Sekolah Kebangsaan, but also the Chinese school and the Tamil school that are controlled by the government, as a way to integrate, make a centralized identity, as a way to keep people together. Because when you think about people, a lot of people think our difference in terms of skin color, of religion, but it's also importantly as well in terms of class, right? What happened with international schools is that they introduce the class dimension into the whole education system, education ecosystem. Sorry. So that's one policy that I think is important. Just deliberalize the school system in Malaysia, disallow Malaysian from enrolling in international school. And once you do that, and then the national school would have more resources, and then you have people, more smarter people, because sometimes in education, it's just not the matter of teachers teaching you stuff, it's also your interaction with your colleague. But if your colleague comes from the same background for you, you don't really learn much. The difference in colleagues, the difference in student background helps in terms of education. I think this is what happened in the US in terms of universities. In US universities, there are affirmative action for disadvantaged communities in the US that happen in US school. That's exactly the rationale that they use for affirmative action at the university level. So for Malaysia, I think that's important. But again, this is easy to talk about, much harder to do really at the policy level. Because again, you have to be voted in. You're a democracy. A lot of this policy that allow for integration is unpopular, because you have to remember a lot of the policy are authoritarian in nature, right? And a lot of people don't like authoritarian policy, and there are trouble with authoritarian policy, but there are costs and benefits they have to weigh. Yeah.
What do you think about language as a way to create this civic nationalism? Because right now, I think for Malaysian context, it's a difficult thing because everyone speaks a different language. How are you going to get together, even to become friends?
Yep.
So yeah, I just want to know your opinion on that.
Yeah. I think that question will get me into trouble. but I don't see language as a problem, right? What I see is the segregation itself. But if you put people that speak Hokkien and speak and Teochew and they don't speak Mandarin or speak anything, they were forced to talk to each other. If you look at Malay with the Tamil person, they were forced to communicate with each other regardless of language, right? Yeah, that was Malay is. It's a pidgin language, right? Malay for the past 200 years is a bahasa pasar. It takes from Mandarin, it takes from Hokkien, from Tamil, from Dutch, from Arab, from Javanese, from Thai even. So that's what Malay is. Of course, Malay now is formalized. But even if you think about English is not it's not a real language, right? Yeah. So I think sometimes we talk about languages, it become very divisive, but we forget that the nature of the division is really the segregation that we do underneath. If you desegregate yourself, regardless of language you speak, right, you are forced to communicate each other, and then you will naturally choose a language that you say. And then people will start to learn each other's language. People become multilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual, whatever lingual they do. That should be the normal way of doing things. But because we desegregate ourselves, and then we remove that opportunity to share space and to communicate in languages that we feel comfortable and learn new languages. In Malaysia, learning language is quite tough at the national school, because you automatically assume, okay, you're Malay, you only learn Malay, English, and maybe Arabic. They force Arabic onto you. Or if you are Chinese, they force you Mandarin, despite the fact that Mandarin is probably not your mother tongue. So the education itself is segregating. That's that, and then you segregate that stuff, and then in classroom, suddenly you have the Muslim go to Agama Islam, and the non-Muslim go to moral classes, doing more exciting stuff. Yeah, I'm very jealous of all of that. I know when I was there, I was very jealous. I want to be in moral classes. I don't want to be in Agama classes. So yeah, I mean, we have to remember the languages are the surface. The deeper level is really the segregation that we do to ourselves. I think that has to be addressed.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I think my main question is around how I feel that you're making a very sort of economic-centric argument, in that you're saying that when economic growth is good, that's when Bangsa Malaysia is possible. When economic growth sort of go down, that's when Bangsa Malaysia is not possible. And then you're also sort of hypothesizing, what's the word? Suggesting that if economic growth were to increase later on, that would make Bangsa Malaysia possible again.
Yep.
Though I wonder whether there are ways in which you could complicate this economic-centric argument a little bit. And I think the main reason why I said that, it's because I would personally think that Bangsa Malaysia would no longer be as possible as back then, because I feel that right now we're in a moment whereby we have been so disillusioned with the idea of like this sort of multicultural inclusion because of so
Yep.
many failed attempts in some way with Satu Malaysia, with different kinds of political sort of contestation that happened in the past few years. And I guess I'm also thinking about how gradually with time, it's not just economics that have changed, but our sense of like sort of how we have understood the political context in Malaysia, in that how do we understand Malays' ethno-nationalism, for example, that has been sort of reflected more and more with time. And also, I guess I'm thinking about how perhaps in the 1960s, 1970s, that's soon after sort of the emergency, soon after the sort of racial riots, and that's a period where there's a lot of fear and insecurity and instability. But right now I feel that there are also increasing movements of people pushing for greater inclusion that is a little bit more, I guess, genuine, because I guess people are recognizing that Bangsa Malaysia, when Mahathir proposed it, people are realizing it more and more that like it was a very non-genuine attempt of including people. I guess with those sort of like reflection that has happened over time, that was possible just because we have moved further and further away from sort of the racial violence that happened in the past. It has made us more reflective over time, and I think because of that, I feel that like that's when we also need to consider not just economic argument, but also different ways in which Malaysia as a community has developed as well. But I understand your point of view too, because economics also play a huge significance in many major events across the world. But I just wonder whether there are pushbacks to your mainly economic argument, whether there are other arguments that you've considered beyond just economics point of view.
Sure. I understand. I think that's part of the reason why I mentioned about the social limits to growth. Because growth is, in many ways, at some point, growth cannot bring everything together. But I think the argument is that growth is the foundation. If you don't get the foundation right, a lot of things cannot go in place. And you're right about it's also a matter of context, because again in the 1970s and the 80s we were through tough time, we were fighting each other, and Mahathir came with the idea, then okay, it's something new. But here, when you talk about non-genuine attempt at inclusiveness, right? It was non-genuine, definitely. It was there's a more political motive behind it, because he needed to win the election. But the thing is, finally, although it's non-genuine, people actually believe in it. More and more people started to believe in it. It took a life of its own, that it's beyond Mahathir control. Okay? Mahathir proposed it, but now a lot of people that believe in Bangsa Malaysia actually against Mahathir. So it took a life of its own, definitely. Definitely in the 1980s, it happened. So here is another point that I didn't mention in the talk I did just now. Sometimes, a lot of times, you have genuine people fighting for inclusiveness at the ground level, at the grassroots level. But it's also important to have the state itself support you. But it's the state fighting you, that's when it's very hard. So in the 1990s, in a funny way, the state was believing in inclusiveness, although it's non-genuine, but the policy was such as that, was for inclusiveness, and there's people that fighting for inclusiveness at the bottom. So there are two sides of the spectrum pushing for the same agenda, so that work. But when the state is not fighting for it, it's very difficult, because the state also have their own power to galvanize certain grassroots to fight the grassroots for that fighting for inclusiveness. I mean, we saw this happen in the 2000. That's exactly what happened. So yeah, to summarize, there are social limits to growth. I agree. Malaysian society has become more complex. The context of the 1990s and now and the 1960s are very different from each other. But I think the argument is that the economic growth, there are social limits to economic growth, but it's not the only thing. But it is the foundation of everything. If you don't get the foundation right, a lot of other things that you do is becoming much, much harder to accomplish. I think that's the main argument that I'm making. Okay? Thank you.
From one millennial to another.
Oh, no, I know.
how do you think this ends for our generation? Because I mean, you talk about the eras and
Right.
years and periods, but like I'm curious to know what you think about generations in the sense, because you mentioned like the people in the 90s who, but they are not of the 90s. I mean, they're probably boomers and all that. Like they're still with us.
Yep, they are winners.
What do you think the trajectory of our generation are going to be like? Because
I think we are doomed to become boomers. And I'm saying that half. Yeah. If you think about the boomers, I mean, boomers are very American-centric term. But if you think about the Merdeka generation, right? The Merdeka generation in Malaysian terms, the Merdeka generation, the NEP generation, they did quite well for themselves, right? They are now, millionaires. A lot of them are millionaires. I mean, I'm not saying all of them. I mean, there are still people living in poverty in Malaysia. And we are doomed to be that. We're doomed to repeat our fathers, I suppose. We are doomed to repeat the mistakes of our fathers in my ways, unless we do something about whatever we do. Because we are probably the richest generation in Malaysian history compared to our fathers, right? Because our fathers, our mothers rode the industrial social process, right? And they become, well off. They become middle class. We are standing, at least us in the room, are standing on the shoulders of those middle class to become, upper middle class, or even the elites, even sometimes. And I think we are a little bit too comfortable. The problem with our generation is that, again, we are too comfortable. We are used to be disillusioned. When we become used to disillusion, we too comfortable, and we decided that, okay, we will not care about other people anymore. We just care about ourselves. We do for ourselves, and if I get a chance to move to Singapore, to Sydney, to the US, to Canada, we'll take it, right? So that's our curse, I think. That's our generation. We too comfortable and too disillusioned, because again, you cannot blame us for being disillusioned, right? I mean, for those that are wondering what I'm talking about, this is our generation that were born in the 80s, grew up in the 1990s, probably, and then experienced Malaysia. So you cannot blame the millennials for becoming disillusioned. We were betrayed multiple times, right? We were betrayed in the 1990s. That was the first betrayal that we faced. And then we also faced the betrayal of Abdullah Badawi. Although Abdullah Badawi was really a nice guy, but the way the government conducted is really that people were expecting a fresh breath of fresh air, a different kind of person. It turns out it's pretty much the same. And then, of course, 2018 happened, and then the betrayal of 2020. And now we have Anwar Ibrahim, and then it feels also a betrayal. So you have this generation that are so used to betrayal. So you become disillusioned and you stop caring about the country. I think that's our danger. That's our curse. That's the danger that we might face.
Hello, hi. Okay. Am I loud and clear?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So in your book, you talk about the clashes of values as one of your sources of deep frustration.
Yep.
So and you've been experiencing that since back in the days where you go to uni and so on and so forth. So now fast forward to 2035, where Malaysia is experiencing modernity like no other now, with the increasingly digitally connected of this country, and the state of the people in the administration whatsoever, and also I think we are also more connected yet also divided more than ever now. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel about these clashes of values from your POV in the present?
Well, it's playing out in the media. It's playing out outside. But it's inevitable. The clashes of values is inevitable. Will always be there. So again, I have, it's a tough question. You know that I'm like blabbering, not even answering it. Like trying to not answer it. So I think that come back to the book. The clash of values will always happen. I think and people will believe what they believe. And somehow we need to convince them that there's another way, right? We don't have to fight the inclusive way for everybody. And if you become Malaysian in the very sense of civic nationalism, it doesn't mean that you have to ditch your other identity. It could be any identity that you want, right? But the fact is there's room for you in that Malaysian identity. And again, as I mentioned in the book, the foundation has to be right. The foundation is really economic growth. If your economic growth is very weak, then a lot of things that you want to do become much, much harder because people wouldn't stop believing in it. Because at the end of the day, people think with really their stomach, right? If they have jobs, comfortable jobs, and they have future in the job, and they start to make leeway for mistakes, for instance, right? Leeway for mistakes, more tolerable to because sometimes I should tell you a story, right? A story that happened to my friend. He was in Kampung Baru. She's a Chinese. So Kampung Baru is very crowded. If you've been to Kampung Baru, it's very crowded. And if you want to park your car, you can have to park like an asshole, right? Yeah, just the nature of. Again, that also go back to the idea of bad planning. The government is not doing the job in creating a better way for people to interact. In terms of traffic, in terms of public transport, government is just not doing it enough. So, coming back to the story, so you have to park like an idiot. So she parked an idiot, right? But the thing is, she was parking in front of this kedai. It's a Malay kedai, Kampung Baru Malay kedai, inevitable. So the guy put something in front of the kedai so that people don't park. So she moved it. Yeah. I mean, and then they park. In normal situation, if you are Malay with a Malay, you will gaduh. They will be like, curse you lah, and then you move, right? But because she's Chinese and the kedai is Malay man, suddenly become racism, right? Suddenly become racism. So you could see, it's wrong. You could see parking there is wrong, and then you could see racism is wrong. But if you change the equation in terms of racial balance, suddenly racism is taken out of it. And then you start to realize, okay, wait a minute. The controversy happened, the quarrel happened because there's not enough parking space, people relying too much on cars, it's too crowded, there's competition. And there's just conflict, unnecessary conflict that's created because of planning, public transport, all those stuff. So you start to realize, okay, the friction is really not because of race or whatever, it's just because bad planning, bad urban planning. So talking about values, we can address this clash of values if we, again, do our planning right. But a lot of planning comes back to the idea of growth. And because a lot of planning will require money, right? And money will come from growth. Of course, people have to pay more taxes lah. That's the thing. So once you have this money, you can create this space that take away unnecessary controversies, unnecessary conflict that happen everywhere in Malaysia, and actually lower the temperature and allow these values to stop competing and becoming more collaborative.
I just wanted to say I appreciated the book in terms of, the nostalgia that it brings back. I was reading this book and I was like, how do I express the feeling of the 1990s? This was it, right? The feeling of like, wow, everything also can. One comment that I just wanted to ask what you thought about this was, I think as we talk about development, I think one thing that was a bit missing from me with the book was talking about migrant workers.
Yep.
Because at the heart of development as we speak, as though it's a very, homogenous, like, oh, Malaysian and Malaysia, but like at the same time with the strengthening of, not strengthening, but the more focus on citizenship and all of that, and at the same time it's at the expense of these people. Like, I think also our understanding of, I'm curious to know what you think, our understanding of what development means, who's benefiting. I think there's such a big class that is definitely not, and I don't know, I'm just curious what you think and your reflections in the book specifically.
Two things. First thing about migrant workers. Although I think I did mention about migrant workers, at least Indonesian migrant workers, and a little bit of squatters, right? I think because the squatters is a manifestation of migration and the economic growth over there. And I did mention about how the government was clearing these squatters, right? And that was development, but it come at the expense that real connection that people have make. Again, in the book, I mentioned a story about there used to be a squatters in Kramat. I mean, in fact, there's a lot of squatters in across KL. There was Abdullah Hukum. Right now it's a mall. Previously it was squatters. In PJ, there was Kampung. What's the name? Kampung Tuku is not squatters. I mean, it's Kampung Baru. Don't say that to Kampung Tuku people. So, there are a lot of squatters. The point is, a lot of squatters, and the squatters was cleaned out by Mahathir and the Selangor MB at that time as well. And the migrant workers were the victims of it. But I mentioned in one of the book in the chapter about how the squatters in Kramat, that there were friction between the original resident and the squatters, the Indonesian squatters. There were friction, but after a while they actually had a symbiotic relationship. So when the government bulldozed down those squatters, the original Malays were unhappy. They were fighting the government because, why are you kicking the squatters out? These are our friends, our neighbors. I think that's also something that I mentioned in the book that I think I acknowledged a little bit, maybe. I understand I didn't go too much, but I think I acknowledged a little bit about the contribution of migrant workers in Malaysia. I think the second point I don't think about is that I've forgotten that second point. Development, right? You're talking about development.
Looking forward, right? And
Yeah.
the state is increasingly also dividing that us Malaysians and them migrants.
Yeah. I think, yeah, I'm, despite the fact that some of the idea in the book is authoritarian, I think I like to consider myself as a liberal. But again, we live in a complicated world. It's not easy to just pick a policy, pick a side, and say you're liberal and you're conservative. No, it's very difficult these days. The world is so complicated. But again, I've forgotten what I want to say about development. About migrant workers and development. I think here is where, again, when we talk about Bangsa Malaysia, we talk about inclusiveness. This is where the idea of inclusiveness have to include migrant workers as well, right? Especially not just migrant workers, but also the refugees. We want them to have a better life. We want them, if you're a refugee, you have to be able to work to support yourself, or else you're running from somewhere to Malaysia and then suddenly you leave. You cannot work, that's difficult. So we have to be more accommodative for these people. And a lot of time, we need to spend money, not just in Malaysia, but also in places like Myanmar, right? We have to support development abroad so that they have less reason to come here. If we don't want them here, then we have to spend money to make it better for them over there. So there's a lot of trade-off you have to make. You have to spend money abroad that might not be popular with taxpayer. I mean, even if Anwar Ibrahim spend money in Gaza, there's also criticism already. So imagine if spending in Myanmar, which Malaysia had done. Malaysia built a hospital in Myanmar. Or you have to let them work in Malaysia and, give them more rights. EPF, for instance, the recent policy of forcing employers to give migrant workers EPF, that's a step in the right direction in terms of becoming more inclusive, more equal, so that kind of thing. So we have to think, again, I think at the end of the day, we have come to the stage that we need to stop thinking about development in terms of concrete. We have to think about rights, about how we can enable ourselves and our neighbors and our co-workers and everybody else that's not within our circle as well to live a generally okay life. We don't have to oppress them.
thanks for your presentation. I mean, what I liked about your presentation is that it was a very sort of macro kind of thing, where you all these factors that really shaped the 90s of Malaysia. But I recall in your book, as I read it, it's mostly about there's a fair bit about your personal experience, right?
Yeah.
Growing up in the 90s, and that was actually what being this sort of nostalgic millennial myself, that was what really resonated with me, right? All these sort of signs of optimism and possibility, right? So I was thinking, could you share with us some of those, your personal kind of things growing up? Because thinking about my own experience, actually the 90s to me felt like I don't know, it felt like there was a lot of skepticism actually about the sort of messaging that the state was trying to propagate, right, in terms of unity. So I'm just kind of curious why you took this sort of more optimistic thing. How did you feel that, and what were the kind of signs that made you feel that this is a real thing instead of something to be skeptical about, as a kind of a thing, a message that actually corresponded between state and people maybe at one point in time. So I'm just kind of curious why you think that way.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the reason I feel the way I felt is that, I mean, it's easy to say things that I say because I was a beneficiary of the 90s. Many ways, the state were kind to me, as I wrote in the book, right? I went to a good school. I went to a generally good school. I mean, city school is generally good in the old days, right? It's very hard to go to a school in the cities and not be a good school. And given scholarship, just after the financial crisis, I had a cousin that was supposed to go to the US, but because of financial crisis, he couldn't go. But I somehow got lucky, the timing. So I was a beneficiary of the state of that time. And the state, I guess, personally, in that way, tried to tell me something. I mean, again, it's non-genuine, let's just put it. But it felt like it resonated, right? Because I went to school, to a multicultural school, before I went to a boarding school, which is not multicultural. But I went to a multicultural sekolah rendah, sekolah menengah, a little bit. And I had friends, I had Chinese friends, I had Indian friends, I had even friends from Indonesian migrant. The father was a illegal migrant, but he went to school somehow. And so he feel multicultural. And the state was telling me, okay, yeah, this is a natural state of being. I said, okay, this is the natural state of being. This is what we should accept. It feels normal, despite the fact that that was not normal at all. It was a very peculiar time in Malaysia, which is abnormal compared to other times in Malaysia. So I think that's the reason why the short answer is that I was a beneficiary of the state. Yeah.
Hi, so you describe yourself as an economist, but you also dovetail a lot of kind of macro discussions with a lot of micro descriptions of interpersonal relationships in the 90s and how that differs from the texture of urban relationships now. And I was wondering, I guess I was curious how you conducted your research, kind of blending the macro and the micro to be able to derive that kind of qualitative on-the-ground understanding beyond just your personal experience. Growing up in the 90s?
I think one advantage I had was that the book was written over 8 years, right? Over 8 years, you could travel a lot of places. And I think another thing was that at that time, when I started writing, I was working with the Financial Times. So working with the Financial Times means that I get to travel to places, to some places that I wouldn't go in Malaysia, or even southern Thailand, for instance. I went to southern Thailand in Narathiwat, Patani, and Yala for a week or so, or 2 weeks, I can't remember. So that's a different kind of Malayness. And then somehow I got to work with Tony Phua, and Tony Phua somehow took me to places in Sabah and Sarawak. So I got to also see things happening in Sabah and Sarawak, to have a little bit a wider view of Malaysia. So, and of course, I've been living, at that time I was already 20, 30 years of living, so I also have my own experience to write about, so that make it easier. So the fact that I've already lived a fair bit, I traveled a fair bit in Malaysia, and also it took 8 years to write this. So it's a lot of notes. Notes was very thick. In fact, the book, the original draft was probably double the size. But Amir Muhammad wanted me to cut in half. So it was cut in half. And when it cut in half, he still complained. It's like, our normal book is usually 200 pages. Yours is like almost 400. So because it was written over 8 years. So that's how I get all the notes and all the details.
So my question follows on from that. What did you cut that you wish you had put in?
Sorry?
What did you cut from the draft that you wish was in?
Yeah. I mean, there are, I think one big chunk is really a little bit of history of Tampin. Because Tampin, if you read the book, Tampin is my grandfather's house, kampong. So a little bit of history of Tampin. And I mean, history of Tampin quite long actually, right? And in history of Tampin, because if you read the book, there's a lot of sense of betrayal. Mahathir, especially a hero and then a villain and a hero again, and then he villain again. So there's a lot of theme of betrayal. And in the history of Tampin, it's also a theme of betrayal. Because Tampin now, Tampin and Al-Gajah especially. Al-Gajah is in Melaka, northern Melaka. It used to be part of Tampin or Rembau, somehow, Negeri Sembilan essentially. So Melaka and Negeri Sembilan, remember your map. Al-Gajah used to be part of Negeri Sembilan, among the Minangkabau, one of the Minangkabau people. And then what do you call that? The British took over Melaka. The British took over Melaka and they thought Al-Gajah was part of Melaka instead of being an independent state-led or part of Minangkabau communities. And the British really, really wanted Al-Gajah to be part of Melaka because they thought it is part of Melaka. Despite the fact that people in Penang said, no, you're wrong. The British Penang told the Governor General that was located in Singapore, I'm mistaken, that Al-Gajah or Naning, you probably know it as Naning. Naning is probably what people would call it. It's not part of Melaka, it's actually independent. We've done this before, the Dutch done it before, we come to the conclusion that this is the best. But the British, the Governor General, I can't remember the Governor General name, is Fulton? Can't remember. Decided, okay, you're all wrong, I am the Governor General. Take Naning and it is part of Melaka, so they went to war. So the British went to war with Naning. The first war, Naning won, surprisingly. I don't know how that could happen, but the British lost. So they're unhappy. So they sent a second expedition and they won. And the way they won it is that Rembau, because Negeri Sembilan was multiple states, right? There's Rembau, was Tampin, there was Sungai Ujong, which is Seremban, a bunch of other things, can't remember the whole 9 states or 7, can't remember. So the way they do that is that the British went to Rembau, or Tampin, can't remember which one, I think Rembau, and said, we have no quarrel with you. We recognize you as a state. The Queen of the British Empire decided to recognize you as a state if you help us suppress Naning. So Rembau agreed and helped the British defeat Naning. So Naning, to this day, is part of Melaka, which is now Al-Gajah. So that's one, I think, quite thick section of the book, about 50 pages, 60 pages maybe. So that was cut because Amir said, yeah, it seems to be a digression. I think a lot of people have written more about Naning than you. So probably take it off. So I took that off. There were other things which I cannot remember right now. I'm bad at remembering because writing this book is also about a therapeutic experience. Because I told before, during the book launch and a couple of the book events, I told that people that the reason why I wrote this book because I was angry. And I needed to understand why I was angry. But now I've written the book, I'm less angry, and also I've forgotten some of the stuff that I've written inside. So I cannot remember other details. But the Naning part is probably about 60, 70 pages worth of stuff being cut.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Sorry,
Hi.
Just curious, you mentioned on being betrayed for those born in the 80s, right? Going through the 90s, betrayed by Tun Mahathir, and then Abdullah Badawi, and then 2018. And just wondering if there's anything specific that you think the current government or the the authorities, the powers that be currently should be focusing on to make sure that we don't get betrayed? Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I'm just one person. I mean, yeah, personally. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I understand it's a difficult situation within the government because nobody has the votes, really. So they have to make compromise. But sometimes, I can understand that. But sometimes when the students, for instance, go down to the ground and said, we want to, protest corruption, and then you send them to the lockup, that feels a little bit, I mean, I did that. I did that when I was younger. When I came back to Malaysia, I did that. I understand how it feels. I understand how it feels to stand in front of the balai, waiting for some of their friends to come out with the lockup at night. So I know that. So when the government did that, it's like, this is not why I imagine it to be. So those kind of things that the government shouldn't do lah. I mean, should give more leeway to the students lah. So that's one of the things that I feel government should do. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, but I don't know.
Hi, sorry. Firstly, thank you for your presentation and thanks for the book. I really enjoyed reading it. My question sort of ties into the relationship between Bangsa Malaysia and class.
Yep.
Do you think there is that relationship? And alluding to your graph, we see Malaysia go through different phases where you have the growth of the middle class and right now the subsequent decline of the middle class.
Yep.
Do you think there's a link between that in order to revive the idea? And do you think it's only an aspiration for the middle class?
No. There's definitely a class dimension to it. Because Bangsa Malaysia of the 1990s was really a middle class values. In the 1990s was really a middle class values because you in the cities, you are multicultural, you are exposed to ideas not just between your neighbors, but also across the world. And the world specifically mean London, but also Cairo and Istanbul and Singapore. I shouldn't say Singapore, because Singapore was part of Malaya at that time. It was widely considered part of Malaya at that time. But also places like Jakarta, Peking or Beijing, New Delhi. So these ideas were coming together in Malaya and all these things. So, and it was middle class and you got to access to modern education. But this middle class these days are really upper middle class now. They are probably elite as well. So the idea of Bangsa Malaysia, the problem with idea of Bangsa Malaysia now is that they increasingly become an elite, a subset of elite values. Values of subset of elites because the middle class has graduated. So that's a problem with Bangsa Malaysia as well. There's the risk that they become an elitist values and then people would just reject it. And this happened when Singapore was part of Malaysia. Lee Kuan Yew were supporting Bangsa Malaysia, but a lot of people see it as a certain class of values, and people rejected it because it's people see it as a class, it's a different class. That class you can say you're Bangsa Malaysia because you're a certain class, but not going to work. So there's a challenge for now lah. Now the values become very elitist, so that's a danger. They have to find a way to make the idea appeal to the middle class more, to return to the roots of Bangsa Malaysia. Yep.
If there are no more questions, I think maybe we can close the session here. Okay, thank you very much, Hafiz.